Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining our webinar today on anti-Semitism. My name is Audrey Kitagawa, and I'm the chairperson of the G20 Interfaith Forums, or IF20 for short, Anti-Racism Initiative. This initiative seeks to continuously develop sensitivity to racism within the scope of the IF20. We are conscious of having diverse representation of persons of different races, ethnicities, faiths, and gender. We invited 3 prominent women to be on our panel today who were unable to participate. They are Madam Justice Rosalie Abella, a retired member of the Supreme Court of Canada, Ms. Deborah Lipstadt, the American Envoy for Religious Freedom, who is awaiting her confirmation by the U.S. Senate, and Ms. Noah Tohar Tishby, Israel's Special Envoy for Combating Anti-Semitism. We look forward to the possibility of their future participation. Our moderator today is Professor Asher Maoz, the founding dean of the Perez Academic Center Law School and the head of the Committee on International Relations of the Center. Professor Maoz, please take the floor.
Thank you, Audrey. I wish to start with a question. You know another name for the present pandemic, say for coronavirus? No, I don't refer to COVID-19. I believe that many will be surprised to learn that coronavirus is being referred to as Judea virus. Jews were so accredited due to accusations that the virus had been developed and was being spread by Jews. They are the one who would find a cure for the disease, selling it to the ailing world and making a fortune. If this reminds you of the 13th century Black Death, you are not wrong. Then 2 Jews were accused for spreading the plague, which brought about the killing of thousands of Jews with the purpose to purge society. If you wish, this is anti-Semitism in a nutshell. On the one hand, accrediting the Jews with outstanding intelligence and abilities. On the other hand, using their superpowers to inflict misery on Gentiles, or at least extracting their money. How old is anti-Semitism? Is it when Pharaoh ordered the Hebrew midwives to kill all male newborns? Or is it only 24 centuries old when Haman, the prime minister of Persia, persuaded King Ahasuerus to issue an edict of extermination of all Jews within the empire? The excuse was, there is a certain people scattered and dispersed among the people in all the provinces of your kingdom. Their laws are different from all other peoples, and they do not keep the king's laws. Therefore, it is not fitting for the king to let them remain. Let a decree be written to eliminate them. We were saved, however, thanks to Queen Esther's beauty and wisdom. Haman's plan to exterminate the Jewish people was almost achieved during the last century when the Nazis succeeded to destroy a third of the Jewish people. If there was hope that the Holocaust could put an end to anti-Semitism, we were totally wrong. Anti-Semitism grew stronger and spread around the world. We are lucky to have today 3 distinguished speakers, 2 of them graduates of the Soviet gulags, Natan Sharansky, who is with us now, and Yuli Edelstein, who is being kept behind. He's member of the Knesset, and there is some vote taking place. He'll join us a bit later. And both of them reached top positions after immigrating to Israel, as Speaker of the Knesset and Chair of the Jewish Agency. Each of the speakers will present his thoughts, followed by questions from the audience, which you are welcome to present via chat. May I call upon Natan Sharansky to take the floor.
Thank you, Professor. I was born and grew in the Soviet Union, in fact, in Ukraine, in Donetsk, the center of this barbaric war which is taking place at this, or aggression, which is taking place at this moment. But then when I lived in Donetsk and later in Moscow, there was no war. But it was very clear that we as Jews have a big problem. Only because it is written in the idea of your parents, they were Jew, you have big problems. You'll have big problems to get to the university, you'll have big problems in having your career, and so on. Why? Nobody could explain. Simply there was prejudice that Jews are not loyal part of the population, and the government behaved accordingly. More than this, also Soviet Union had very hostile attitude towards the state of Israel. And after 1967, in fact, it stopped after the victory of Israel against its enemies in the Middle East. Soviet Union stopped diplomatic relations. And each time when there was campaign against Israel, Jews knew that they were expecting for being fired from their jobs, or they will have some problems. So this connection between discriminating Jews and attacking Israel at the times of Soviet communist dictatorship was very obvious. And when we start fighting for our rights as Jews, it was so organically connected also to our struggle for human rights, and that's why I could easily be this activist and spokesman of two movements at the same time. The Zionist movement and human rights movement of the Soviet Union. For everybody was connection very clear. If you want to live as a free citizen in Soviet Union, and if you want to live as a Jew and be connected to your people, in both cases, you are an enemy of this regime. So then I, after many years in prison, and then finally the Soviet Union falls apart, I joined my people in freedom. And I want to believe that anti-Semitism is kind of something belonging to the dictatorship, that in the modern world, especially after the tragedy of Holocaust, there is no place for anti-Semitism. And then there came this Durban Conference in 2001. And so this conference, which was prepared for 3 years by United Nations as the first international conference against racism, it's all turned into the conference against Israel. And suddenly the old myths about Jews who are controlling the world, and who are controlling the finance system, and who are imposing on the other people their way of life and so on, I meet it already not as a Jew in the Soviet Union, but as an Israeli politician. And when I say, wait a minute, but don't you see that your criticism of Israel becomes attack on Jews? I'm told all the time, no, you're wrong. We are not anti-Semites. We love Jews, but it is a legitimate criticism of the state of Israel. And then I decided to find out where are the borders between legitimate criticism or simple criticism of Israel as any other democratic country should be under criticism, and sometimes under strong criticism. That's and self-criticism. That's the way how democratic states exist, where it becomes anti-Semitism. And then I proposed my so-called 3D principle, which is demonization, delegitimization, double standard. It is typical tools of anti-Semites for 1,000 years. Demonizing of Jews. The Jews are the closest to Satan. Jews are those who are using the blood of the Christian babies for making matzah. Jews are those who are spoiling the wealth. Jews are, when the Rothschilds of the world are organizing all the wars. That was the accusation, demonization of Jews. That was the tool of anti-Semites for those centuries, 1,000 years. So when we see intellectual from the West who is coming to Israel and says, I went to the refugee camp of Palestinians, that's Auschwitz of today. And I have to say, I said immediately, that's anti-Semitism. I was many times in refugee camps. It's a shame that Palestinians, fifth generation of Palestinians, lives in refugee camps. And we can debate a lot who has to be blamed for this. But what it has to do with Auschwitz isn't typical demonization. And jumping now in 20 years after this, when just now we have already report of respectable human rights organization who says apartheid is today is Israel. And but they have to change the meaning of the word apartheid. I was the friend of Nelson Mandela. I was international observer of the elections in South Africa. I know very well. I spent a lot of time in Soweto. I know what apartheid is. But when I propose, let's discuss what apartheid is, what is the definition of apartheid, and what is the situation in Israel, we are dismissed with that is demonization. And then, of course, delegitimization. How it can be that the only state that again and again is raised the question whether it is a legitimate state, and it is raised on the international forums, that it's raised among the lawyers and among politicians, whether Israel is a legitimate state. What else state there is raised question about its legitimacy? Stalin wrote an article that Jews are not a legitimate nation. Early Christianity, we can read about Jews as a nation or as a religion should not exist anymore because now it is replaced by Christianity. So today you can see how the same tools which were used against Jewish people applies to Israel, and of course it influences also on the attitude of Jews. Double standard. BDS, and I have to deal a lot with the BDS, with the boycotting of Israel. By the way, I can accept that some people can be so angry, like, for example, now on Russia for its aggression in Ukraine, and they insist on sanctions. But there must be some criteria. Okay, then all the countries which do what Russia did to Ukraine have to be put under sanctions. That's I can understand. Israel is singled out. The only democracy in the Middle East is singled out for boycott and sanctions. Again, it's not accepted by the free world, but it's something which creates atmosphere of extremely discomfortable atmosphere on the campuses in America, in other countries, and more young Jews are feeling embarrassed that they belong to the nation, to the country, which is so demonized, which is almost illegitimate, and the standard of dealing with it is so different than the standard of dealing with the other country. But I want to say that anti-Semitism exists for 1,000 years. I'm dealing with this in the last 50 years. And I see how the same ancient hatred and prejudice toward Jews is taking different forms. It can be religious, it can be national, it can be directed against Jewish state, but in the end, it comes to the same. It comes or to pogroms, or to shooting in the synagogues, or to firing Jews, or disconnecting Jews from many institutions of the free society. And that's why it is very important to understand that there should be zero tolerance to anti-Semitism on the left and on the right. To those who say, we love Jews, but we hate this awful Jewish state, or those who say, oh, we love Israel as a national state, it's great, it's exactly in accordance with our ideology, but these liberal Jews, what a headache it is, what a problem it is for the other people, and so on. All types of anti-Semitism in the end are equally dangerous, murderous, and we have to fight with these prejudices both on the left and on the right.
Thank you, Emayon. Thank you, Nathan. I would just like to mention Nathan is not only the recipient of the highest Israeli award, he is the only Israeli recipient, and maybe the only living recipient of the two highest awards of the United States. I mentioned that Yuli Edelstein and Nathan Sharansky have two things in common. First, they were graduates of the Soviet gulags, and they achieved top positions in Israel. They have another thing in common. They were saved to a great extent thanks to their wives. Avital Sharansky, those who are old enough, can remember that unbelievably. She went around the world. There was no leader that she avoided meeting if he wanted or didn't want. And interesting, once Nathan came back to Israel, you don't hear from her. That was her mission in life. On the other hand, Yuli Edelstein, they tried to accuse him of being a drug dealer. His wife, his then wife, late wife, was smart enough to throw out what we call the box of Havdalah. Havdalah is an event at the end of Saturday when Jews mark going out of the holiday into the weekday, and then we use some scents that we breathe. She was smart enough to throw it away because that's what they wanted to find in order to accuse Yuli of being a drug dealer. I see that Yuli joined us. Yuli, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I even managed to hear parts of what Nathan had to say, and I want to greet you and my dear friend Nathan Sharansky and all the participants. I understand that we'll soon hear from the participants, their remarks, their questions, so I'll try to be brief. Unfortunately, I have to agree with what you, Professor Maoz, said in the beginning. There have been hopes that anti-Semitism is part of this or that ideology, this or that period in history. And the example I have in mind is something that I remember from many, many years ago. There was a well-known historian and a writer in the former Soviet Union, Professor Luria, and he wrote a historic book called Anti-Semitism in the Ancient World. He was a specialist on ancient world, on ancient Egypt. And in his preface to this book, he writes a very interesting thing. He says, actually, that he started his research somewhere in 1915, 1916. And then he says the Great October Revolution happened. And I decided that as part of my approach is that all the historic research should be relevant to present times, I'd better stop researching for this book, because in this new regime of communism, everyone will be equal and there will be no anti-Semitism. Mind you, the book was published in 1918, meaning that it took him some half a year to understand that this regime or that regime, communism, and everyone is equal, but anti-Semitism is not disappearing, it remains. And unfortunately, we see it up to this day. I remember in my capacity as Minister of Public Diplomacy and Diaspora Affairs, we were in charge of presenting to the government, usually it was around the International Holocaust Memorial Day, a report on the state of anti-Semitism in the world in different countries, different Jewish communities. And what strikes you always is that no matter what the situation is the reasons will always be there. What I mean is that once there is, let's say, some conflict, military operation going on in Gaza, obviously there are protests all over the, let's say, Europe in this case, and some other countries, countries on other continents rather, against the Israeli, you name it, occupation, violence, with many slogans and many remarks bordering on anti-Semitism, or actually what my friend Nathan Sharansky once defined as the modern anti-Semitism. And you just, substitute the word Jew for the word Israeli or Israeli soldier, and then everything is legit. They add blood to their matzah and all this stuff. But once there is a relevant calm here in the area, you presume that the numbers would go down, and it doesn't happen. I remember specifically during the economic crisis here, everything was relatively calm, but the economic crisis unfortunately struck many countries around the world. And it very quickly, from this modern anti-Semitism connected to Israel, quote unquote, occupation, apartheid, and all the other nonsense, it became good old anti-Semitism, with Jews ruling the world, Jews possessing all the money, Jews controlling the banks, Jews causing hunger, and so on and so forth. So, unfortunately, there are different roots, different causes, different excuses for anti-Semitism, but they're always there. Everything I say doesn't mean that we have to raise hands. I think that we at least are in the situation where mainstream politicians, mainstream newspapers, mainstream media are not willing to be openly anti-Semitic. As I've said, unfortunately, some of them could be easily defined as such when they substitute the word Jew with the word Israeli, but at least on the surface of things, they're not willing to be defined, to be called, to be addressed as anti-Semites, which is already an advantage. And I think that the state of Israel is doing, it should continue doing something in this field, meaning trying to bring the message to different governments in democracies, democratic countries around the world, that it's their vital responsibility to make sure that every expression of anti-Semitism is addressed and is punished, and it's their best interest, and it's definitely not something that Israel has to deal with, but the local successive governments have to deal with. I think that I myself said that I'm talking about democratic countries, democratic governments, as we just witnessed in what's going on in the Ukraine. When countries are democracies, it's very difficult to run a serious dialogue. The illusion that sometimes there is a dictator that loves the Jews and respects the Jewish community usually expires, and everyone understands it's just an illusion. And anti-Semitic statements, they kind of reappear and resurface, like we just witnessed in the case of the Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov, with this wonderful remark about Hitler being of Jewish origin. And it presumes us, or it presents us rather, with a serious challenge, because I, for one, don't know how we, as the state of Israel, can address the situation in non-democratic countries. Rather, I think that the local Jewish community should be thinking twice about staying in regimes of that kind. Thank God there is the state of Israel, they're most welcome. But having said all that, and to sum it all up, I think it's very important to monitor anti-Semitism. It's very important to combat it, having in mind that, I guess, like with COVID, we can't get to the 0 point, but this pandemic, anti-Semitism, has been around for thousands of years, unfortunately is going to stay, but our task, our joint task, is to always keep it low and to always remind good-willing people and governments and media that, as we learned many times in history, it always starts with the Jews, it never ends with the Jews, and it's the best interest of all the countries all around the world, if they want to stay vibrant democracy, to make sure that anti-Semitism is not part of the discourse in their countries. Thank you.
Thank you, Yuli. I must apologize to the Americans. In Israel, we refer to everyone, including the leaders, by the first name. That's because Kol Yisrael Chaverim, at the end of the webinar, I'll translate it for those who didn't understand it. There are two more connecting factors between Nathan and Yuli, which I would like to mention. The first one is when President Bush welcomed Nathan at the White House. He asked Nathan, "What can I do for you?" And Nathan said, "Put all your pressure to release Yuli." The other connecting factor is one who should have been with us, Erwin Kotler, who was instrumental in putting pressure to release both Nathan and Yuli. And now, my dear friend Peter Petkov.
Thank you. And before I start, I just wanted to say how humbled and honored I am to participate in this webinar because it's a topic which is very close to my heart. But I also have to say that I'm particularly privileged because I'm the only non-Jewish person who is speaking in this panel. The seminar comes at a time when the Western Hemisphere experiences an unprecedented wave of neo-Nazi processions in capital European city, and it has witnessed a centrality of the narrative, the language of denazification in Russia's propaganda over the war in Ukraine. And what both references represent and have in common, in the words of a friend and a colleague, Alberto Meloni of the University of Bologna, is a profound loss of a critical sense of history. To this, I will also add one more thing, which in my view is a fragmentation of our thinking about anti-Semitism. In the same way, we think in a fragmented fashion about Christianophobia, Islamophobia, and indeed any phobia which is borderline hate speech or incitement to hatred within what we recognize as the terms of Article 20 of the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights. A fragmentation, this webinar and the very hard work and remarkable work of the IF20 initiative on anti-racism is addressing successfully, but is only making inevitably slow steps in doing so. While I have observed with great concern the resurgence of acts of anti-Semitism at a time one would have not expected to witness, particularly in Europe with its strong laws prohibiting incitement to hatred and Holocaust denial, I could not stop thinking how we all bear partly the responsibility for fragmenting the discourse and regimenting too quickly incitement to hatred, to party lines, and making our approaches to anti-Semitism, Christianophobia, Islamophobia, racism too specialized, too narrow, and therefore too compartmentalized. We have too many departments. We have anti-Semitism on their agenda. They tick their boxes. They have their Holocaust Memorial Day. But as far as changing hearts and minds on the ground, very little seems to happen. And the extremely successful interfaith dialogue in other areas has exacerbated the problem rather than addressing it. The weaponizing of the fragmentation, in the war in Ukraine, and the largely toothless responses of the whole army of interfaith leaders has largely exemplified this problem. Anti-Semitism is increasingly seen primarily as a sociological problem, despite the heroic efforts of all parties involved just to not to see it as one of the other phobias. And it's often packaged unhelpfully as defamation of religion, and it has not become really a crossroad of an existential crisis for us as a human family. And until this happens, we will not address its full and complex implications, unless we see it as an existential crisis for us all. We have largely lost the thread of a number of Christian voices reminding us that anti-Semitism is part of a systemic moral failure. Already in the 19th century, the great Russian religious philosopher Vladimir Solovyov reminded us that whatever one may be prepared to say about the Jewish attitudes to Christianity and agree or disagree with such attitudes, there is no doubt, and there has to be a consensus and there cannot be a debate that Christians have failed systemically and catastrophically to relate to Jews by fulfilling their own Christian precepts. Similarly, the French Christian Orthodox priest, Father Lev Gillet, in his book Communion with the Messiah, which is remarkably written as early as 1941 during the Holocaust, reminds us that Christianity, and especially Orthodox Christianity, has a heavy historical guilt for the anti-Judaism in the past, which no doubt has prepared the ground for the Nazi campaign. In this respect, I would like to go back, since we are trying to reclaim important critical sense of history in this conversation, and go back to a small act of interfaith heroism, without making too much much that it's interfaith, that it's confrontation with acts of anti-Semitism. And this small act of heroism remains exception rather than a rule, and resulted in the rescue of 50,000 Jews from Bulgaria in 1943. In what could be described as a social and political trench warfare, spearheaded by the Deputy Speaker of the Parliament, the head of the Orthodox Church, involving bushy overweight Orthodox bishop laying on the railway in front of the trains which were supposed to leave for Auschwitz, jumping fences to be with Jewish detainees, and even apparently performing a Kabbalistic ritual with the Bulgarian chief rabbi while he was hiding in the lodgings of the head of the Bulgarian Orthodox Church. These people did not win all the battles, but won enough battles to be treasured and honored by children of survivors, from Michael Bar Zohar to General Gabi Ashkenazi. They could not save the Bulgarian Jews in Macedonia who perished in the concentration camps in Germany, but saved enough Jews to enable them to leave their marks in shaping the modern state of Israel. And while we are thinking, how did they do it? We could be reminded of the minutes of a meeting of the Synod of the Bulgarian Church of the 2nd of April 1943. In those meetings, we read the following statement: "The Jews know well that there is nobody to speak for them with authority but the Bulgarian Church, and if she acts more forcefully, her voice will be heard. And if our church does not intervene to defend this wretched people, we should expect even worse outrages of acts of cruelty, for which our good-hearted people is going to feel shame from which they will never be able to recover, and perhaps other misfortunes." The leader of the Orthodox Church, Stephen, did not only use this language of seriousness, but he always often combined it with a terrifying sense of humor. When challenged by German diplomats for being anti-German at the German embassy in Sofia, the head of the Bulgarian Church made it clear that he's an admirer of many Germans, and then explicitly quoted a line of authors like Stefan Zweig, Thomas Mann, and Albert Wassermann, more or less the authors whose books are being burned on stakes around Germany. These people did not identify themselves as engaging with an agenda or following a line, although the Gestapo resident in Bulgaria in those years has expressed his frustration that these simple Bulgars cannot get the agenda of anti-Semitism. They did not try to justify their acts of remarkable bravery in a context that, with which their country was a German ally. They did see this as an existential crisis for them, as well as for the entire humanity. At the time, by comparison, when the papal nuncio in Istanbul, Roncalli, the future John the 23rd, who transformed the vision of the Catholic Church about its rapprochement with the Jews, was only prepared to comment, yes, we have to help the Bulgarian Jews. After all, not all sons of Judas are bad. Sadly, I do not see many acts of committed responses which parallel this today. Despite the years of work and investment in interfaith leadership, there doesn't seem to be an edge through which they could respond to existential crises of such scale, and their responses to Ukraine only confirmed it. There was no robust engagement with the range of propaganda which was, among other things, also not just borderline, but openly anti-Semitic. Moreover, the Moscow Patriarch said nothing and did not even have an extraordinary meeting at the outbreak of war to try to see whether they have anything to say. Divided we fall, and without seeing anti-Semitism as a microcosm of phobias which degenerate and potentially lethal forms of incitement to hatred, we will continue to fall. Without engaging with anti-Semitism in a deeper and more systemic way, we risk of making it as fairly irrelevant box-ticking exercise, which is not going to engage with the deeper roots of it. I hope that the current events in Ukraine and beyond, as they will test our normative imaginations, will be both a challenge and an opportunity to see the resurgence of anti-Semitism as a reminder that it is not a Jewish problem only, but an existential one for all of us, and this will help us overcome the fragmentation of our commitment, understanding, and engagement with it, with a sobering reminder of Pastor Martin Niemöller. First they came for the communists, and I did not speak, and so on and so forth. You know the rest of the text. And on this, I'll rest my case. Thank you.
I mentioned before Avital Sharansky. She's really the hero. I must tell you, Nathan, between the two Sharansky, Avital is the hero. It's unbelievable. I couldn't believe it. There was no leader in the world. If they threw her out of the door, she would come back from the window. She was just a proof that there is no barrier too high for a loving woman. And what a loving woman. Just after marriage, she came to Israel. Nathan told her he couldn't leave yet. And he said, you go, and I'll follow you soon. That soon took a lot of years, and they could enjoy the honeymoon just many, many years later. But at least you got compensated that you had your honeymoon in Jerusalem. So now we can move to the questions. The first question is really relevant for today. The question was, how does the Ukraine war affect the Jews? And as you heard from Nathan at the beginning of his talk, he was born in Ukraine and then moved to Russia, so he can speak for both sides. Yuli himself was born in Chernobyl, which moved, it was when you were born, I don't know what it was when you were born, maybe Moldova. My parents lived in Chernobyl when it was Romania. From there, they were sent to the concentration camp in Transnistria. I believe today Chernobyl is in Moldova, if I'm not wrong. So how does the war in Ukraine affect the Jews? And I would add to it, how does it affect the state of Israel? Because Israel finds itself between, I would say, two hammers or to handle. Nathan, please.
Well, there are too many questions in one. Very brief. I think, of course, Jews of Ukraine, as everybody in Ukraine, are in big physical trouble, and they many of them have to run away, to be refugees in every meaning of the word. Of course, Jews are luckier than the others because they have the country which is ready to accept as many of them as want. They have the representatives of Jewish agency who are sitting on the borders of the 4 countries on the borders of Ukraine and helping as GPS is helping them to find their way. But yes, it is a very tragic situation. On the other hand, I would say that Jews of Russia are a much more bigger problem as all the population of Russia, because Russia becomes the country behind the Iron Curtain of information. Russia becomes a country isolated from all the free world and even non-free world, and Jews are afraid. It's not accidental that there is big increase of immigration from Russia in general, and specifically Jewish immigration. I believe that in the next few months, at least twice as many Jews will come from Russia to Israel as from Ukraine. And as to the state of Israel, what I can say, it is not simply the battle for the small piece of land between Russia and Ukraine. It's the effort of Russian dictator to change all the principles on which free world is based and our freedom is guaranteed. That's why I believe from the very beginning that all the free world has to be united in this struggle. And I hope that Israel, which does some serious efforts in humanitarian efforts, and the others will play even bigger role in helping to win this battle. But again, the fate of Ukraine reminds to all of us how it is important that Jews have their country, and that our fate is not, our future is not in the hands of our enemies, of the dictators of this world, but in our own.
Okay, thank you, Nathan. Yuli, what would you like to add?
Yes, thank you, Asher. First of all, I think that, historically speaking, this war in Ukraine, maybe, I'm not a historian, maybe someone will find a different example, but I think that for over 100 years, since World War I, Jews were not in the situation that was described during World War I in different stories, how a soldier from the Army X is shooting a soldier from the Army Y, and both shout Shema Israel. This is, at least theoretically, the first time the Jews can find themselves fighting each other in different armies, though, thank God, I don't think there are too many Jews in the Russian army, but at least, as I've said, theoretically, this is a war where Jews can find themselves fighting each other for different countries. But this is, I guess, more of an observation. Now, the situation with the Jewish community in the Ukraine definitely is, as Nathan described it, as tragic. It may be easier for the Jews because they have the state of Israel, they have the support, and they have a clear destination in case they are able to leave. But still, let's not forget that we are talking about the Jewish communities that were flourishing till just 2 or 3 months ago. And right now they find themselves in total disaster. And as far as the state of Israel is concerned, I hope it's getting a little bit better now, but in the beginning, I publicly expressed my disappointment. I think that the Israeli position could be much more clear as far as this conflict is concerned. Yes, I know the argument of Israel being between the rock and the hot place. I know that, but I think that fear is not policy, and the policy should be being on the right side of history here, and not just because of the Jewish communities who are under attack, but because I think in general we have to understand that Jews can survive only in the world with certain set of rules. When there are no rules, and when someone can decide that just for the sake of doing it, or for whatever reason, he can invade another country and bombard another country, I'm absolutely sure that the world in general will not be a safe place, but definitely not for the Jews, and the state of Israel as the country that is irresponsible for the Jewish people and large could, I think, react slightly stronger at the beginning of the conflict. But right now, I hope, after some criticism and after some maybe even some pictures coming from the Ukraine, the position is a little bit changing for the better. There is more support of Ukraine. There is more help, and not just humanitarian help. And I hope that we'll find the right way to express our attitude towards this terrible war.
Okay, thank you, Yuli. I must add, one of the most moving moments that I experienced was when Yuli, as Speaker of the Knesset, addressed the Russian parliament, and he decided to address in Hebrew, and he explained why, and this has to do with anti-Semitism. He was arrested because he did the big crime of teaching Hebrew. That was the excuse for his arrest, and then, as I said, they tried to turn him into a drug dealer. Peter, what would you like to add?
Thank you. I think that the war in Ukraine is going to be a very important wake-up call for some of the points I tried to make in my short presentation, that in the same way Russian propaganda essentially attempted to undermine the legitimacy of the Ukrainian government on several fronts, proposing that the Ukrainians are not proper Orthodox Christians, that the Ukrainian leadership is neo-Nazi and therefore not by extension anti-Semitic, and by bringing Chechen fighters who clearly speak in prime time Russian media how the Ukrainians are shaitan, they have to be exterminated, and so on and so forth, is appeasing different faith communities to justify the war in Ukraine. And this only calls for not just highlighting how thriving and important the Jewish communities in Ukraine are, but in their relationship with other communities, and how their future with their Jewish connections, with their Ukrainian connection, is interdependent with the future of stable Ukrainian institutions, but also good relations with Christians, Muslims, and other minorities in Ukraine. And as long as we find a way that we speak in one voice about this toxic propaganda, which affects not only Jews, but also other communities which are at the receiving end, we would not be able to address the challenges. Of course, we could speak about how Ukraine has been an important intellectual hub for many important Jewish voices. Of course, we could speak about how important it is for the Hasidic communities as pilgrimage route and so on and so forth. But this is not going to address the systemic issues, that if you start developing a particular line and package a particular government or particular leadership as being Nazi and trying to denazify it, if you repeat it for long enough, there'll be enough people who are going to listen and believe in it. And it doesn't matter whether this kind of taking propaganda on board is going to have only the Jewish communities as the recipient. They would have impact on the way the Russian propaganda has intoxicated the perceptions about the war and about what the Russian state does in relation to Ukraine amongst the Russian people. Of course, there are plenty of voices which are opposing to this narrative, but the mainstream media continues to do that. And unless we actually come up with consolidated voices responding to that as a counter propaganda, as a counter narrative, we'll be letting down not only the Jewish community, but all the free speaking people who speak against the war today.
One of them out of all places from Kurdistan, asking how can we make Israel stronger? But I would like to combine this question with one other question that I received. How would you regard the Israeli settlements in the West Bank in other terms than apartheid? I want just to mention one thing that was clear from both Nathan and Yuli's addresses. We are not looking for preferential treatment. We are just asking to be treated evenly with all the rest of the world. Well, I decided to combine both questions, and I would like, Nathan, if you could start.
Well, first of all, I'm glad that people in Kurdistan think how to make us stronger. Kurdistan has a big challenge. Kurdistan, which is trying to be free, independent for many dozens of years, is divided among 4 non-democratic countries which are trying to deprive them of this. So I feel there is a lot of sympathy and solidarity between Jews and people of Israel and Kurds and people of Kurdistan. As to how they can make us stronger, resisting to the attempts to delegitimize Israel and to apply double standard, which is not applied to the other countries. And here I'm coming to your mentioning about the territories and the settlements. Look, I spoke and wrote and voted in the government a lot on this topic. I believe that the big problem of Israel is the lack of any democratic institutions on the other side. I believe that the real peace, and I was always for 2 states, meaning that I always believed that Israel should not control the life of Palestinians. I believe that they must have all the rights that I have, including their own state. But it is the state which should not destroy us. And the only way to have trustful relations is not to base our peace efforts on supporting dictators like Yasser Arafat, who is trying to destroy all the beginnings even of democratic society on the Palestinian side, but to the contrary, to encourage the civil dialogue, the civil building of civil institutions. And from this point, by the way, Abraham Accords are the real very good beginning, because not like the previous accords, it is people to people, it's open conversation, it's mutual efforts to build independent economy and independent life. That is the way to solve the problem of the Palestinians, and not trying to make agreements with the other dictator who will be a problem not both for Palestinians and for the state of Israel. Well, I wrote so much about it that it will not be enough even 1 year course. So that's what I can say as my immediate response.
Thank you, Nathan. Yuli, please.
Yes, well, as far as the question from Kurdistan is concerned, I totally agree with Nathan. I think that Abraham Accords show that there are more and more people in the area that understand that Israel is not part of the problem, it's part of the solution. And as someone who had the privilege first as recently as health minister of Israel during the pandemic to have Zoom meetings, not physical meetings because of the pandemic, but Zoom meetings with my counterparts, both from the Emirates and Morocco, and even sign agreements of cooperation with them, memorandum of understanding. I do have to say that it's very impressive to see, to witness firsthand how people see, as I've said, Israel as a partner, as a friend, and not as part of the problem here. So I hope that sooner than later, the people of Kurdistan will also manage to build their independent country, independent state. I know they're doing everything in their power to achieve it. And we will have another friend in the area. It will make Israel stronger by definition. As far as the question about the Jewish communities in Judea and Samaria is concerned, I would like to reverse the question and say, how can one possibly see this as a form of apartheid? As someone who visited South Africa many times and had the privilege of meeting many South African leaders and speaking to them about the way they were solving the problems and whatever, there's nothing in common. There's no common denominator between this definition of apartheid and the situation in Israel or in Judea and Samaria. It's a part of the typical anti-Israel propaganda, bordering on anti-Semitism quite clearly. But in practical terms, in easier terms, I would say that I once had that experience in one of my previous positions of taking, rather I would say sending a number of senior American journalists to visit an industrial zone in Samaria. And after that, I met them, and one of them, a senior American radio host, by the way, very pro-Israel in his approach, and it was not his visit to Israel, and not his first visit to Israel. He was running towards me after that visit and said, Minister, you know what we saw? We saw Jews and Palestinians working together. So I said, really? He said, yeah, and you can't imagine. Some of the Palestinians said that they were actually the bosses and the Jews were working for them. So if that's a form of apartheid, I guess I'm a very poor student of the apartheid studies. But to cut it all short, as I've said, there are lots of labels aimed at Israel. This is one of them. It has nothing to do with apartheid whatsoever. We can argue, we can have a discussion. That's why we call it disputed territories. But it's a political discussion. It has nothing to do with apartheid or anything else.
This is a very difficult question to answer, and it's in a way it is not directly related to the conversation we're having now. I as an outsider who is very interested in Israeli politics and who's very interested in a peaceful solution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, feel very uncomfortable when terms from other regimes are borrowed to describe the situation on the ground in Israel. Apartheid in South Africa was a legal arrangement. It was a particular setup of rules which established the relationship between different groups within South African society. The situation in Israel on the ground is much more complex. There are certain things which which refer to international law. Some areas are still treated by the United Nations as occupied territories. Some areas are treated as essentially parts of the territory of Israel recognized by the United Nations. And this is and some territories are recognized as territories administered by the Palestinian Authority and the Gaza Authority. It is extremely difficult to describe and really compare this extremely complex and difficult range of issues which are administered by different rules. This may change, but hasn't changed so far, with an apartheid. People often use it as de facto apartheid rather than de jure apartheid, but I don't really find this very helpful because it is a conversation stopper. And one could acknowledge that the situation on the ground is difficult and complex. One could acknowledge that there are plenty of parties on both sides who really wish to find a solution. But until this solution is found, and there is one legal order which essentially completes the peace process, we cannot really talk about apartheid or something alternative to apartheid in territories which are essentially having, at least as far as the international community is concerned, different and very complex status. With regards to language, I just wanted to add something which is slightly kind of indirectly connected to the questions, finding different language about talking about different things. I think since the seminar is more about anti-Semitism, and I was just going to propose more as a counter question to our other two distinguished speakers, since we seek for a more authentic and more grounded language which deals with challenges of anti-Semitism, is whether you would accept a certain perspectives on the way the concept and the reference points of anti-Semitism have been expanded in relation to a critique of the policies of the state of Israel as an extension of the concept anti-Semitism. Whether, in your view, you find this helpful or less helpful as an extension of the understanding of anti-Semitism, because there are plenty of commentators who are friends of the state of Israel, but also find this extension to critiquing policies of the state of Israel as a form of anti-Semitism as creating a chilling effect, whereby people you would like to have conversations with and discuss more robust approaches to anti-Semitism, they wouldn't actually enter into the conversation because they feel that broadening the understanding of anti-Semitism has made people more reluctant to really engage in meaningful conversations about anti-Semitism.
Well, thank you, Peter. First of all, I agree with you. That's not part of our webinar, but I decided to bring it up so people won't argue or think that I avoid hard question, and it is a hard question. If a moderator is allowed to have also an opinion, I agree with all three of you. I would just like to add one thing as a law professor and another thing as a realist. As a law professor, let me tell you that the mandate to Britain was accorded by the League of Nations on both sides of the Jordan River, meaning Israel, what is called the West Bank, and the East Bank, what is now Jordan. All these territories, according to the League of Nations, were supposed to form the homeland for the Jewish people. And according to a rule in the UN Chapter 80, I believe, the decisions of the League of Nations are binding. This is not to say that I am in favor of conquering Jordan, or even of getting control of all over the West Bank. I agree with Nathan that a workable solution should be worked out. However, there is a problem when we come to sit down. We have to sit down and talk. But we had a very bad experience. We withdrew totally from Gaza Strip. Every inch we gave back, and you know every day what's happening there. This is a bad experience for the Israelis to say, well, are we going to have Gaza also in the West Bank? Now, another question, which is connected in a way, people ask, how can we defend Jews in other countries? Nathan, what can we do to defend Jews in other countries?
I don't understand. Wait, what can we, Israel, or what can we, the world? As to the world, the free world has to protect all the citizens of the free world from the prejudices, from the persecutions, from violating of human rights. So fighting against anti-Semitism as all types of racism is the necessary thing for those who want to continue enjoying the life in the free world. And as we could see with the example of Putin, who personally is not anti-Semite, who has positive attitude to Jews, but the world as he wants to create it, his imperialist vision is very dangerous for all, including for Jews. Now, as to Israel, Israel took on itself the mission at the moment that it was created, that it is going to defend first of all, to give opportunity to every Jew of the world who wants to join us, but also to fight against anti-Semitism. And I have to say that as the head of Jewish, not as the head of the member of the government, later the head of Jewish Agency, I'm very proud by the efforts which Israel is doing through our representatives, or through special programs of giving Israeli experience to Jews, or through special programs of education against anti-Semitism, or through our international relations, making the fate of the Jews, the fate of the Jewish citizens in the other countries, part of our negotiations about our diplomatic, political, economical, and other relations. And of course, the fate of Soviet Jewry, the struggle against Iron Curtain, the struggle for the liberation of Soviet Jewry is a good example of how all the world participated in the struggle, but it was Israel which was the source of our inspiration, and it was Israel who was coordinating this struggle.
As I told you, Yuli is in the midst of voting in the Knesset. Nathan is smiling because he's now relieved. He just remembered now what came off his shoulders by not being in the Knesset. Peter, you are as an outsider, and if I may say, as a non-Jew, how would you answer to the question, what can we do to defend every Jew in every country? We got a few people asking the same question.
Well, considering that I'm known by my Jewish friends in Jerusalem as Ben Peter, I don't feel as a complete outsider, but I'll say a few things. Well, first of all, the more important thing is that there has to be an environment where Jews, as Jews, should feel safe. And the same applies to any other minority which is demarcated in one form or another. So human rights approaches are clearly the key, combined with any particular approaches driven by initiatives as anti-Semitism, discrimination on grounds of nationality and ethnicity or religious belonging, and so on and so forth. But in terms of tools, beyond the human rights and other legal tools, it is very important to invest in education, and through education to create civic dialogical spaces where different groups could actually get to know one another. Israel, as well as beyond Israel, represents a very interesting trend, which I recognized when I was in Jerusalem during my visits. That when I go to Shabbat dinners with my Jewish friends and we talk about religion, we talk about Christianity and Judaism, it occurred to me that pretty enlightened, educated Orthodox Jews of a younger generation have hardly any connections with indigenous Christian groups in Israel beyond the Christian Zionists, which I thought quite remarkable. And we came to the conclusion that if there are more opportunities for dialogical spaces where different groups will get to know one another in a respectful fashion, they may actually begin to enjoy each other's companies and understand that they have a lot more in common than what they think divides them. The trouble is that this divide exists beyond Israel. Jewish communities do not have as many opportunities to interact with non-Jewish communities in a sort of dialogical civic spaces. Things are changing. A lot of interfaith projects are trying to address this, but it's very little has really been done to do it so deeply that the divide and the sense of lack of security could be overcome. And we just have to continue doing things we have started doing and doing it even more than we're doing it at the moment. I'm personally very positive. There is a lot of things which are happening on the ground which are remarkable, but I would like to see more. And beyond the way Jews feel safe or less safe in the global north. I think that our ultimate goal is that Jews should one day be able to benefit not just from their right to return to Israel, but also that they could be able to have their right to return to the Middle Eastern countries from which they had to flee in order to move to Israel. It would be incredible if the thriving Jewish communities and unique Jewish communities of Babylon or of Egypt or Ethiopia would feel safe to go one day back to the homes of their ancestors, and they're going to be welcomed, and there's not going to be a threat to their lives. But this is part of obviously a much bigger objective and a much more complex agenda, which may not be impossible, but it's linked to a whole range of other things, like recognition of the right to existence of the Jewish state by its neighbors, and going deeper into improving relations, signing peace treaties, and so on and so forth. But I think we need to be much more ambitious than just thinking it would be very nice if the Jews could live a comfortable life in Western society. We need to go beyond that to really feel that we have achieved something.
Okay, thank you, Peter. No, actually, this is more or less, there are many questions repeating each other. I think I summarized all of them. So we'll just give the speakers 5 minutes or so to say whatever they wish. Nathan, please.
I'm sorry, in any way, I have now to move to my Zoom with Jews in Ukraine and Kiev. And of course, it's very important this moment they will feel themselves connected and supported. I only want to say, it was mentioned already, that anti-Semitism starts with Jews, it doesn't finish with Jews. Today, we can feel how our free will should not be taken for granted, how in fact it can be challenged in the most profound way, and how solidarity of the free world is extremely important. 2 months ago, nobody expected this awful barbarian aggression in Ukraine, but frankly, also we didn't expect such a strong expression of solidarity and readiness to fight for freedom, not in Ukraine, but also all over the world. And I think that's also that's true about anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is 2,000 years old, maybe more, but the readiness of people to fight against anti-Semitism, and we find it again and again in the most difficult moments of our history, it's something what gives a lot of strength and confidence for our future and for the future of the free world. So I thank you, everybody who participated in the seminar, but also everybody who is concerned and is ready to deal with this problem, not only because of sympathy to Jews, but because of our mutual concern for the future of the world in which we will live. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, the audience. I had a very hard time to find a slot of an hour to get Nathan from his engagement in Ukraine. I think he also traveled there, but it was very hard, and I've been told that he won't be able to stay till then. In this day, since the war started in Ukraine, Nathan is a Ukrainian more than an Israeli. But thank you very much for your contribution. And now, Peter, whatever you would like to say.
I probably won't be able to speak for 5 minutes, but I'll just summarize some of the points I made earlier. While we would agree that engaging with agendas which in one form or another have been pursued very professionally in terms of combating anti-Semitism, I would still try to appeal that we deepen our experiences in doing so, go beyond the formal professionalized means and very effective means of dealing with anti-Semitism, and really try to relate it to wider problems, not in order to lose the focus on anti-Semitism, but to really relate the cause of anti-Semitism with deeper commitments of the human family, to really use this as an opportunity to create an understanding of a world not as a place, but and not an understanding of universal humanity not as a place, but as a meeting where you encounter different and yet enriching types of human commitments and understanding of the world. I have been very concerned that the interfaith process, which we have seen as a paradigm-shifting phenomenon after 9/11, has not reached as much as we would have expected it to reach in terms of dealing with challenges of problems such as anti-Semitism in the context of faith communities, despite of an acknowledgement that different religious groups have moved on. We still see deplorable forms like internet communities, which particularly in 1990s Russia, where there was a particular internet community which was thriving on finding patristic sources which would justify anti-Semitism, and the churches didn't do anything about this. Obviously, things are moving on, things are changing, but we could do a lot more on that front, and we could all do it. Jews, Muslims, Christians, people of other faiths, as well as persons of no faith. But what is really going to be most challenging is that anti-Semitism becomes as one of the tokens which every government, every policymaker, every office has on their agenda, so they could show that they're compliant and they're not being seen as being anti-Semitic. Anti-Semitism, as well as any other incitement to hatred, runs deep, and unless we really engage with the roots of the problem, we would never be able to engage properly with the problem itself. And in this respect, Jews as well as non-Jews have a responsibility to lead, because a lot of the forms and the trends in dealing with Christianophobia and Islamophobia have often adopted and appropriated the forms which have already been developed in order to deal with the challenges of anti-Semitism. The problem is that this has made a lot of those agenda too much looking as self-serving, related to a particular community and irrelevant for the community outside of that group which is under attack. And we need to find ways to really find more holistic approaches and linking those trends of incitement to hatred as having common patterns, having common causes, and deal with them as a macrocosm of problems, identifying the specifics relating to different minorities which are under attack, but nevertheless seeing them as a responsibility for the whole human race rather than a responsibility for the group which is under attack. There is still a lot to do in this respect. I could see that the United Nations is changing their course, and they're beginning to think of defining an incitement to hatred as a much more overarching commitment, but there is still a lot to go, and religious leaders have a lot to play in this respect, a great role to play in this respect, and they could do a lot more that they have done so far, beyond formal meetings where representatives of religious groups meet, embrace each other, kiss, and say how there are no problems and they are one universal humanity, and really bury the real problems on the ground, which remain terrifying and unresolved. Plenty for us to do, but hopefully this kind of meetings and conversations are an opportunity to re-energize our efforts and our imaginations and our intuitions, how we could do this in new, more imaginative ways, and hopefully more effective ways to deal with real problems on the ground.
Thank you, Peter. If I may say a few words, as I said, I hope that moderators have also an opinion and they may express them. I think it was clear from what both Nathan and Julie said. Israel is not immune. Not every criticism of Israel is anti-Semitism. However, let me share with you an experience that I had many years ago. I joined the Israeli ambassador to Geneva to the Palais des Nations for a meeting of the Human Rights Commission. The Human Rights Commission was headed then by a diplomat from Libya, from Gaddafi's Libya. And the session was, of course, about condemning Israel, that Israel violates human rights, which made me a bit laugh, but also cry. You may be surprised to learn that Israel is being condemned by the Human Rights Commission and by other commissions of the UN more than all other states together. Not more than Syria, not more than Russia, not more than Chad, not more than Libya, more than all other nations together. So I would like to argue that we are not such a monster worse than all the world altogether. And this has to say something, and it's not disconnected from anti-Semitism. When you I think it was Abba Eban, the uncle of the present president of the State of Israel, that said once Jews were not allowed, were discriminated for being Jewish. Now Israelis are discriminated for being Israelis. And he said that the same anti-Semitism, it only changed phases, and people who will enter, and I encourage you to enter the G20 Interfaith website, and if you are kind enough to me, read my blog again. I'm there quoting a long quotation from a British politician, non-Jewish, non-Israeli, but I think he got the point. Before I close up, I would like to thank certainly the speakers, Peter, who is still with us, Yuli and Nathan, who left, and I would like to thank also, every performance or event has many people behind the screen that work and you don't see them. You can see Audrey, who was just outstanding in arranging this event. This event, as she said, is under the roof of her anti-racist initiative. And I would like to thank Mariana, Taylor, and some other people. I'm sorry, I don't remember their names. You didn't see them at all. Neither Tyler nor Mariana. Mariana was handling the questions, otherwise I would have been lost. And before closing, let me say about anti-Semitism, let me quote a priest, not a Jew, not a rabbi. That priest said, when they came for the gypsies, I didn't care, I'm not a gypsy. When they came for the communists, I didn't care, I'm not a communist. When they came for the Jews, I didn't care, I'm not Jewish. And in the end, they came for me. and everybody should know who comes after, and not only because of that. Even if they don't come because of me, when they hunt gypsies, communists, or Jewish as human beings, we should stand up against this. And maybe, as the priest said, in the end they'll come for me as well. But even if they don't, we can't take it as a 21st century such a situation. And we just had the Holocaust a few weeks ago. I wanted to have the webinar on the Holocaust Day, but of course Yuli and Nathan were busy with other events. And each Holocaust Day, the memorial, they publish anti-Semitism around the world. And the last year, anti-Semitism grew. Incident grew all over the world. And like in the United States, in the last 4 years, it doubled and tripled. And I say the United States because it's not Russia, and of course in Russia, the more so. So people just didn't learn from history, and as one said, those who don't learn from history repeat the mistakes. Only, unfortunately, we Jews will have to pay for the mistakes. Anyway, I'm sure that all those who joined us, and I must admit, from 104 people who joined, 95 stayed all the hour and a half. It never happened to me in a webinar, which means that they are interested, and I guess that the webinar was interesting as well. And I urge you all to enter the website of the G20 and join the other webinars that we are going to have. Thank you very much. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depends from where you talk. And okay, Mariana is thanking me too, so thank you, Mariana, for thanking me. Thank you a lot. All the best. And we should hope and strive for a better world for all people. Thanks.